The mother stood in the center of the kitchen, staring at the empty shelves as if somehow something would appear. The cracked cupboard doors hung open, revealing nothing but dust and old memories of better days. In the dim light filtering through the torn curtain, she could see the worn floor beneath her bare feet, the cold roughness of it pressing against her skin. She listened carefully, as if expecting the silence itself to offer a solution, but there was nothing, only the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere far down the street, and the faint creak of the house settling into its sadness. She placed a hand over her stomach out of instinct, feeling the hollow ache that had become too familiar. But it was not for herself that she worried. Behind her, from the corner of the room, the soft whimpering of her child filled the air, delicate and broken, like a tiny bird whose wing had been crushed. She walked over to him, kneeling carefully beside the threadbare mattress where he lay. His face was pale, his lips dry, his small hands grasping at the air as if reaching for a dream he could not find. She smoothed back his hair, whispering soft words of comfort that even she no longer believed. There was no milk, no bread, not even clean water left in the plastic jug by the sink. Everything had run out. Everything had crumbled. She had gone to every neighbor she could, knocked on every door she thought might still have a heart behind it. But times were hard for everyone now. Pity was a luxury no one could afford. The local aid office, once a place she believed in, had turned her away 3 days ago. Too many applicants, they said. Not enough to go around. Come back next month, maybe. She had walked home that day carrying her child and the last shreds of her pride, telling herself she would find a way. She always had before. But now, even her stubborn hope was beginning to rot at the edges. The cupboards did not lie. The cold house did not lie. The hunger did not lie. Then, late that afternoon, sitting on the front steps with her child cradled. Against her chest, she overheard 2 women talking as they passed by. Something about a small charity in the next town over, giving out boxes of donated goods. Milk, they had said. Cans, diapers, maybe formula if she was lucky. The women spoke with that casual tone that people use when they know they will be okay, when they do not have to measure every word against the edge of desperation. But for the mother, their words struck like lightning. A box of milk, a box of life. She asked them timidly, afraid of being brushed off, and they pointed in the general direction. It was far, they said. About 12 hours walking, maybe more. No bus ran that way anymore, no car to borrow, no taxi she could afford, just long stretches of cracked highway and dirt roads, weaving through forgotten fields and abandoned homes. But it was hope, it was something. That night, she could not sleep. She sat beside her son, watching him twitch in his sleep, his small body restless, his dreams tainted by hunger. She thought of the journey ahead. She thought of her feet blistering, her arms aching, the hot sun beating down on them. She thought of what might happen if she failed. But most of all, she thought of his face, if she succeeded, if she came back holding that box in her arms. Milk, food, survival. At first light, she packed a single torn bag with the few things she could manage: an old towel to shield her son from the sun, a cracked bottle half filled with cloudy water, a worn piece of bread crust she found hidden behind the stove, too dry to be food, but still something. She wrapped her son tightly against her chest, with an old bedsheet, tying it carefully across her shoulders, feeling his tiny weight settle against her heart. He stirred but did not wake. Standing on the threshold of the house, she hesitated for a moment. She looked back at the empty rooms, the sagging furniture, the cold hearth. She listened to the silence one last time, letting it fill her lungs, knowing she might return to find it even emptier. Then, without a sound, she stepped out into the morning, into the pale, reluctant light of dawn, and began to walk. The road stretched out before her, long and unforgiving, like a promise made by someone who never intended to keep it. She tightened her grip on the bag, adjusted the weight of her child against her back, and set her eyes on the distant line where earth met sky. Every step was heavy. Every breath was a silent prayer. She had nothing left to lose, and yet everything to fight for. The first few miles passed in a kind of numb determination. The mother kept her head down, her steps steady, the bundle of her child pressing warm and reassuring against her back. The sun had barely begun to rise, and the air still carried a hint of coolness from the night, though she knew it would not last. She moved quietly along the edge of the cracked asphalt, the fields on either side of her stretching out in endless, empty waves of yellowed grass and dust. There were no sidewalks here, no shade, no shelter. Only the road and the silence. Occasionally, a car would pass by, sending gusts of hot air and swirling dust in her direction. She would lift a hand instinctively, shielding her child's face, and keep walking, her heart leaping for a moment with each engine sound, wondering if someone would stop, would offer a ride, a bottle of cold water, a moment of mercy. But no one did. They sped past, their windows rolled up, their faces turned away. Some glanced at her with brief, unreadable expressions. Some did not even look. To them, she was invisible, an inconvenience, a reminder of things they did not want to see. Hours dragged by with the slow cruelty of a clock that refused to move. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, turning the road into a shimmering river of heat. Her clothes clung to her skin, soaked with sweat. Her feet ached with a sharp, growing pain, every step sending new jolts of agony up her legs. The soles of her shoes, thin and worn long before today, offered little protection against the jagged stones and burning pavement. Still, she kept moving. The child stirred now and then, whimpering softly in his sleep. She would pause, adjusting the sheet that held him against her, murmuring comfort even as her own throat grew dry and cracked. She dared not drink from the bottle too often. There was so little water left and so much further to go. She rationed, each sip, each drop, more precious than gold. She could feel the thirst gnawing at her, a hollow ache spreading from her mouth down into her chest. But her child needed it more. Midway through the day, she found a thin strip of shade beneath a dying tree, its branches brittle and leafless. She sank down gratefully, easing her aching body onto the dirt, careful not to wake the boy. For a few minutes, she simply sat there, breathing heavily, staring at the road ahead as it shimmered in the heat like a mirage. She could not see the end. She could not even imagine it. All she knew was that she had to keep going. She unwrapped the bundle slightly, checking her son. His cheeks were flushed with heat, his tiny fists clenched and trembling. She dipped the corner of the towel into the last of the water and dabbed it against his forehead, whispering prayers without words, desperate wishes sent out into a world that had long stopped listening. When he settled into a quieter sleep, she rewrapped him carefully, tightening the knot of the sheet around her shoulders, steeling herself for the journey ahead. Standing up was harder than she expected. Her legs protested, her back screamed, but she forced herself upright, clutching the almost empty bottle and the worn bag with one hand, keeping the other hand steady against the small of her child's back. She took one step, then another, and the road swallowed her again. The afternoon dragged on mercilessly. The landscape blurred together, fields giving way to abandoned lots, lots giving way to stretches of cracked earth and broken fences. Time lost all meaning. There was only the rhythm of her own heartbeat, the rasp of her breath, the aching of her muscles. Her vision blurred at the edges, her head pounding with dehydration and heat. More than once she thought she might fall. More than once she stumbled, catching herself just before she collapsed, terrified of crushing the tiny life against her. She tried not to think, not to imagine what would happen if she failed, not to picture herself lying there by the roadside, her child crying weakly against her chest, no one coming, no one caring. She focused only on the next step, the next mile, the next breath. Forward, always forward. In the late afternoon, clouds began to gather on the horizon, thick and dark, promising a storm. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something sour, something rotten. She did not know whether to be grateful or afraid. Rain could mean relief from the heat, a blessing on her burning skin. It could also mean treacherous mud, sudden flooding, more danger she could not afford. Still, she kept moving. She passed a gas station long since abandoned, its windows shattered, its pumps rusting into the ground. She paused briefly, hoping for shelter, for anything of use, but there was nothing left but broken glass and empty shelves. Even the vending machines had been stripped bare. She did not linger. She could not afford to waste strength on false hope. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, she pulled the towel over her son's head, shielding him as best she could. The water was warm and smelled of dust, but it cooled her burning skin slightly. She tilted her face upward for a moment, letting it wash over her, a fragile blessing in the middle of the wasteland. The sun was nearly gone by now, the sky bruised and heavy with clouds. The town had to be close. It had to be. She clung to that thought like a lifeline, repeating it over and over in her mind. Close, close. Just a little further. Her steps grew, slower, more labored, her body rebelling against every movement. But she did not stop. She could not. Somewhere out there was a box with her child's name, written in the invisible ink of her desperation. Milk, hope, survival. She would find it, or she would fall trying. And so, under the weeping sky, with the night pressing down around her, the mother walked on. By the time the town's first broken signs came into view, the mother's body had already passed the threshold of pain and moved into a cold, mechanical endurance. She could no longer feel her legs. They moved because they had to, because stopping was no longer an option. Her vision swam, colors bleeding into one another under the gray sky. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, soaking her hair, her clothes, the fabric that held her son against her. Every step squelched in the mud, gathering at the edges of the road. She barely noticed. The town was smaller than she remembered from years ago, back when she had passed through in a borrowed car, back when her life still had seams that held it together. Now it looked like everything else, tired, broken, abandoned, by promises that had never been kept. Storefronts boarded up, windows cracked, the paint peeling from the old post office like sunburnt skin. A few figures moved here and there, hurrying along the sidewalks with their heads down. Coats pulled tight against the rain, their movements quick and guarded. No one looked up, no one saw her. She followed the directions she had pieced together. In her mind, each landmark a fragile thread, pulling her closer to salvation. Turn by the church with the leaning steeple, past the burned-out grocery store, look for the old community center at the edge of the park. It had sounded simple in her mind during the endless hours of walking. Now everything blurred together in the mist and the gathering dark. Finally, she saw it. A low building with faded paint and a crooked sign swinging in the wind. A few cars were parked outside, their trunks open, people hurriedly loading boxes and bags. A flash of hope surged inside her, so sharp it almost buckled her knees. She clutched her son tighter and stumbled toward the doors, heart pounding with desperate relief. Inside, the room was nearly empty. Folding tables lined the walls, but most of them were bare now, save for a few crumpled boxes and torn plastic wrappers. A handful of volunteers bustled around, stacking chairs, sweeping the floor, wiping surfaces that no longer held anything worth cleaning. The smell of damp cardboard and dust filled the air. She approached the nearest table, her voice breaking snow from the dryness of her throat as she asked, almost inaudibly, if there was anything left. A woman in a volunteer vest turned to her, her expression tired and apologetic, the kind of face that has had to deliver too much bad news in a single day. "I'm sorry," the woman said gently. "We're out." We handed out the last boxes an hour. Ego. The words hit her like a stone. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, but no sound came. She simply stood there, the rain dripping from her hair onto the floor, her child stirring weakly against her. She had walked 12 hours. She had risked everything, and she was too late. Someone else brushed past her, carrying a box full of supplies, their face hidden beneath a hood. A few others gathered around the last car in the lot, laughing, shouting instructions. None of it reached her fully. It was as if she stood behind a wall of glass, watching a world she no longer belonged to. The volunteer touched her arm lightly, an awkward, helpless gesture. "We'll have another shipment next week," she said, as if that was something the mother could wait for, as if hunger and desperation could be postponed like an overdue bill. She nodded stiffly, because what else could she do? "Thank you," she whispered, though the words tasted like ash. She turned away before the woman could say anything else, before pity could be offered, like a crumb she could not afford to accept. Outside, the rain had picked up again, a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked through her thin clothes and clung to her skin. She stood beneath the sagging awning for a moment, adjusting the makeshift sling that held her son, pressing her lips against his damp forehead. His skin was hot, too hot. A different kind of fear stirred in her chest, sharp and panicked, but she forced it down. She could not afford fear now. Only movement. The road back stretched out before her, longer and darker than she remembered. Her legs trembled beneath her. Her body screamed for rest, but there was no place here for her to stop, to recover, to grieve. She was a stranger in this town, an invisible burden no one had asked to bear. She had to leave before the last light faded, before the night swallowed her whole. Pulling the towel tighter around her son's fragile body, she stepped off the curb and began the long walk back into the night. Every drop of rain that struck her skin felt like a small blow. Every gust of wind seemed to push against her, mocking her weakness, daring her to fall. She thought about the box she had not received, the milk her son would not drink tonight. The dream that had carried her here crumbled now into wet ash at her feet. She felt the bitterness rise up in her throat, hot and corrosive, but she swallowed it down, locking it away behind the same door where she kept her fear, her anger, her heartbreak. And there was no room for anger, no time for tears, only the endless, empty road waiting to swallow her once again. And so, with the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders and her child's fevered breath warm against her neck, the mother turned her face to the storm and began to walk. The first few steps away from the center felt heavier than the entire journey that had brought her there. Each movement pulled at her like invisible hands trying to hold her down. The rain soaked through her clothes, chilling her bones, but her body burned from within with exhaustion and fevered panic. Her child whimpered against her chest, a frail sound that cut deeper than any wound. She tightened the sheet around him, adjusting his weight carefully, whispering promises she was no longer sure she could keep. "We are going home," she murmured, even though the word had begun to lose its meaning. Home was not walls or warmth anymore. Home was simply the place where she would collapse if she could just make it that far. The town faded behind her with every trudging step, its broken windows and empty streets swallowed by the mist and the gathering darkness. The road ahead stretched out endlessly, black and slick beneath the heavy rain. Her shoes, soaked through hours ago, squelched with every footfall, the fabric threatening to split apart entirely. Blisters had torn open on the soles of her feet. She could feel the raw skin grinding against the worn canvas. Every movement was agony. She clung to the simple rhythm of breathing, of moving one foot in front of the other, like a prayer she did not dare break. The rain blurred her vision, the world reduced to streaks of gray, and the endless hiss of water against asphalt. Now and then, headlights approached in the distance, growing brighter with each heartbeat. Each time she moved further off the road, stumbling into the soaked grass to keep her child safe. She watched the cars pass, one after another, faceless and fast. None of them slowing, none of them seeing her. She might as well have been a ghost, a shadow, something the living chose not to recognize. At some point, the hunger returned. It crept in slowly at first, then sharpened into a gnawing, hollow ache that twisted her stomach and made her knees buckle. She had not eaten in over a day, had barely drunk enough water to wet her tongue. Her body was devouring itself for strength. She thought of the crust of bread in her bag, damp now from the rain, but she did not reach for it. It was not enough. It would not fix anything. It would only tease her body with the memory of food before leaving it even more desperate. Hours blurred together into an endless stretch of darkness and rain. She had no way of knowing how long she had been walking. Time had become meaningless, measured only in the ache of her muscles and the weight of her child. Once, she slipped on a patch of mud, crashing down hard onto her knees, the breath knocked from her lungs. Pain lanced through her, sharp and immediate. She cried out without meaning to, a broken sound that was swallowed by the storm. For a moment, she stayed there, kneeling in the mud, the sheet soaked and heavy, her son's thin, cries piercing the night. Part of her wanted to stay down, to give in to the pull of the earth, to let the exhaustion take her. But when she heard her child's weak, hungry sobs, something deeper than strength pushed her back to her feet. She could not stop, not here, not like this. She checked his face, brushing away the wet hair plastered to his forehead. His skin burned. With fever, his breathing shallow and uneven. Fear coiled in her gut, thick and paralyzing. She had heard of children fading away like this, slipping between breaths without warning. She had seen it once before, in the shelter, a mother screaming into the night while a body went still in her arms. The memory sliced through her, and she cradled her son tighter, shielding him from the rain with her body as best she could. The road twisted through stretches of abandoned farmland, the fences leaning at strange angles, the fields drowned in puddles and creeping weeds. She passed an old bus stop, the glass shattered, the metal frame bent and rusting. For a moment, she considered stopping there, sheltering until morning, but she knew better. The cold would eat at them, the fever would grow. She had to keep moving, had to put as much distance between them and this hollow place as she could. Her thoughts became disjointed, drifting in and out of focus. Sometimes she imagined hearing voices in the rain, distant and indistinct, calling her name. Sometimes she saw shapes moving along the edge of the road, shadows that disappeared when she looked directly at them. She did not know if they were real, if they were memories, or if her mind had finally begun to fracture under the weight of the night. She talked to her son as she walked, her voice hoarse and raw, telling him stories from when he was a baby, from when they still had a home with warm walls and cupboards that opened to something more than dust. She told him about the time he learned to walk, how proud he had been, how he had laughed with pure, unbroken joy. She told him about the nights they used to sit by the window counting stars, how he had once fallen asleep with his hand pressed against the glass, dreaming of places he had never seen. She told him these things because she needed to hear them herself, needed to remember that once there had been more than hunger, more than fear. She needed to believe that somewhere, beyond the cold and the mud and the broken promises, there was still something worth walking toward. The night deepened, the road narrowing into little more than a strip of cracked tar surrounded by wild, overgrown fields. The rain finally eased into a cold mist that clung to her skin and hair. Her body moved on instinct now, each step a battle against gravity, against the urge to simply lay down and vanish into the wet earth. When the first hints of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, pale and sickly, she realized she had been walking for more hours than she could count. She had crossed back into the familiar stretch of land near her home, though it no longer felt like anything she recognized. The air was colder here, the silence heavier. Her house was still miles away, but she knew she would reach it. She would reach it if she had to crawl the rest of the way. She adjusted the bundle against her back, feeling the frail rise and fall of her child's breathing. Still alive, still fighting. And so, with the last remnants of her strength crumbling. Beneath her, the mother kept walking, a solitary figure against the bruised sky, dragging herself and everything she loved back toward a home that held nothing but an empty cupboard and a threadbare mattress. It was all she had left. It was everything. The house appeared on the horizon like a ghost rising from the mist, its outline crooked against the pale morning sky. The mother stared at it, barely believing it was real. The familiar sag of the roofline, the cracked front steps, the battered door with its peeling paint. It had never looked more broken, more empty. And yet it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in days. Home, or what passed for it now. Her legs gave out halfway across the yard. She collapsed onto her knees, the mud soaking into her torn clothes, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. For a long moment she stayed there, hunched over, clutching her child tightly against her chest, afraid to move, afraid that if she let go of him, even for a second, she would lose him completely. His small body was terrifyingly still, his breath faint against her skin. She forced herself up, every muscle screaming in protest, and stumbled the last few steps to the door. Inside, the house was dark and colder than she remembered. The rain had seeped through cracks in the roof, pooling in small, dirty puddles on the floor. The air smelled of damp wood and mildew, the scent of abandonment. She moved through it blindly, making her way to the small mattress in the corner of the main room. She laid her son down gently, her hands trembling, her vision swimming with exhaustion and fear. He whimpered softly, turning his face toward her, and she knew he was still with her, clinging to life with a strength that seemed far too big for his tiny frame. She covered him with the thin, torn blanket, tucking it around him with shaking fingers. Her own body shuddered with cold and pain, but she barely noticed. All that mattered was the rise and fall of his chest, the small, stubborn rhythm of his breathing. She sat beside him, pulling her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. The silence of the house pressed down on her, heavy and absolute. There was no food to give him, no medicine to break the fever, no magic cure waiting just beyond reach. She had nothing left to offer but herself, her presence, her will to keep. Him safe for another hour, another day, however long the world would allow. Outside, the sky brightened to a weak gray daylight. The rain had stopped, leaving everything damp and heavy. She could hear the occasional sound of a car in the distance, the bark of a stray dog, the quiet settling of the earth after the storm. Life continued, indifferent to her struggle. The world had moved on, as it always did, as it always would. She thought briefly about the charity volunteers, about the faces that had turned her away with polite, empty apologies. She thought about the cars that had passed her on the road, their headlights blinding, their tires sending up sprays of filthy water as they sped by. She thought about all the people who would go to bed tonight without ever knowing what it cost her just to return to this place, empty-handed and broken. But there was no room for anger in her anymore, no space left for resentment or blame. Those emotions required energy, and all her energy was spent on surviving, on keeping the fragile thread of life between herself and her child from snapping. The day wore on in slow, aching silence. The mother dozed in fitful snatches, waking every few minutes to check on her son, to press her hand against his fevered forehead, to listen for the soft rasp of his breath. Hunger gnawed at her belly, sharp and relentless, but she ignored it. Her body was simply a vessel now, something to be used up in the service of a greater purpose. She thought about walking again, about finding help, about begging if she had to, but her legs refused to move, her body too depleted to even consider it. She would have to wait, to hope that somehow someone would come, that some mercy would find its way to her doorstep. Hope was a cruel thing she had learned, but it was also the only thing she had left. As evening fell, she sang to her child, her voice low and hoarse, a broken lullaby that she barely remembered from her own childhood. The words hardly mattered. It was the sound, the rhythm, the familiar comfort of a mother's voice that might reach him where medicine and food could not. She sang until her throat gave out, until the darkness outside swallowed the last of the light, until the house was nothing but a shadow filled with shallow breaths and silent prayers. When the night was fully upon them, she lay down beside him, wrapping her body around his like a shield against the cold, against the hunger, against the world that had forgotten them. She listened to his breathing, counting each rise and fall as if it were a miracle. Tomorrow she would try again. Tomorrow she would find a way. Tomorrow she would walk if she had to, crawl if she must. But tonight, there was only this, the beating of two fragile hearts in the dark, the thin thread of survival woven between them, and the unbreakable love that no amount of hunger or exhaustion could ever take away. In the silence, she closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in fierce, stubborn hope. Because even when there was nothing left, she would always choose to stay, for him, always for him.